Hello and welcome to the first installment of this channel, Summer School with Mr. Rabbers. We're going to be taking a look at different lessons that I want to share that maybe I don't get to share during the school year. And I'm going to use this format and this as a way to be able to do that. Because I think there's a lot that we maybe can't get to in school, or just by time, or it doesn't really fit into the curriculum right now, but maybe is still important. And I'm going to try it out this way. I hope to bring in a lot of different people for you to be able to hear their lessons, because I have very limited experience with different things that have happened in my life, but I know of a lot of people that their life trajectory and how the Lord has guided their path is quite inspirational to hear. So we're going to get to hear from them later on this summer. We're going to start things off by talking about one of my favorite things to talk about. And I actually did get to talk about this with the juniors a couple of weeks ago, and that's the space race. And so maybe for those of you, if you're teaching grade school U.S. history and you need some information on the space race, or you want to show a snippet of this, by all means do that. I know I'd always get to around the 60s toward the end of the school year here, and it was one of my favorite times of the year for U.S. history because it is just a lot of fun to talk about. And so we are, I made this presentation, we're going to go through it, and I want to talk about different stories within the space race. And the first story that I want to talk about is that of Wernher von Braun and Sergei Korolev. So von Braun, as his name kind of suggests, he's from Germany, grew up in the early 1900s, helps design these incredible V-2 rockets. Well, incredible for the Germans, not incredible for the British, who they used to bomb. But they're not like your model rockets. They're pretty large. They are some of the first man-made objects to go actually up into space. They come screaming down at many hundreds of miles an hour, maybe cracking 1,000 miles per hour. So almost impossible to defend against. Guided with using gyroscopes, and they can adjust the fins or adjust the thrust vectoring coming out of the rocket. And he really doesn't want to use his rocket knowledge for war. He wants to use it for exploration of space. He's really interested in getting humankind into space and exploring with these rockets. But unfortunately, the military is kind of how you go about developing the rockets at the time. And to kind of perpetuate this idea of exploration and peaceful use of rockets, he actually teams up with
additional rocket-powered sections.
And you'll hear him talk here.
Here we have a cutaway drawing of our rocket, showing the location of the fuel and the motors of each section. The first stage carries 1,060 tons of fuel, and its 29 motors will lift the entire weight of the ship vertically off the ground. The second stage has 8 motors. And
so you would have heard him talk about, he was designing that massive ferry rocket, and it's kind of a crazy thing. It never gets built. So it's powered by hydrazine and nitric acid. Nitric acid, of course, is a very potent acid. It's one of the most potent acids out there. And hydrazine, cancer causing, does a lot of harm to you if you're even close to it. On the Russian side of things, we have Sergei Korolev, and he is, by all accounts, very similar to Wernher von Braun. He's interested in space travel and peaceful use of rockets, but he really knows how to spin the idea of rockets to the military brass. That's how you got funding back then. And he's able to get them to fund his rockets, really make really big rockets for the time. You needed bigger rockets to carry bigger payloads into space, and payloads for the military would have been nuclear warheads. Now we get to the competition between the U.S. and the U.S.S.R. And it kind of starts in 1955 when they announced they're going to make these satellites to study the Earth during the International Geophysical Year of 1957 and 1958. It's going to be peaceful cooperation, sharing information between countries to help better understand the world that we live on. And what better way to understand the world than from a bird's eye view way up in orbit to study different phenomena of the upper atmosphere and the radiation belts. The U.S. thought that they had an upper hand with this because we've got Wernher von Braun and all these rocket engineers that we've gotten from the Germans after World War II. And they thought of Russia as just, backward country, bunch of potato farmers, not going to be able to do a lot in terms of technology and pushing the envelope of science and exploration. But then October 4th, 1957 sneaks up on them, and the whole world learns that Russia was able to launch a satellite into orbit atop a really massive rocket. The R7 is a very capable rocket. It's the same form of rocket as you see if you watch any Soyuz launches today. It's really the same type of rocket. They've improved upon the fuels and stretched the tanks and improved the computers, but really the basic design, if you look at it just from a picture, it looks like the same thing. And that's because it was a really well put together rocket. And of course, a couple of days later, we try it with a Vanguard rocket, and this is what happens. Just goes up a little bit and explodes. So now we get, the media had a field day with this. They called it Flopnik, they called it Kaputnik, and it wasn't until von Braun's team was able to send up Explorer 1 on von Braun's rocket that they actually successfully send a satellite up into space. But here is a comparison, a size chart of the rockets. This is the Vanguard. This is the rocket that von Braun designed to send the first satellite into space, and this is that R7. It's just massive compared to the two. Got these huge strap-on boosters, can take a bigger payload into space, and what has the U.S. worried is that this big rocket can take a nuclear warhead now to the U.S. The Russians don't even have to launch or fly a bomber over the U.S. They can just launch a rocket from their soil and get a nuclear payload to the U.S. And so we fast forward now, and we're into the 60s, early 60s, because JFK has just won the election. He's beaten Richard Nixon. I forget how close it was, if it was a really close race or not. I would guess that it would be if I were to look back and research that. One thing that he won off of in this television debate was the idea that the Russians had a lot more missiles and rockets than the U.S. had at the time. And he really didn't have any evidence to base this on. He was kind of lying through his teeth, but he won. And early in his administration, there was this big misstep of the Bay of Pigs incident, where we tried to invade Cuba. The CIA was kind of working off some bad information, or they were kind of put in charge of it, and things went south pretty quickly to try to overthrow the communist leader, Fidel Castro. Really embarrassing for the U.S., really bad publicity. JFK is thinking, we need to win, and maybe space is the avenue that we can beat the Russians and to kind of show them up. And so he asks Lyndon Baines Johnson, his vice president, this question: do we have a chance of beating the Soviets by putting a laboratory in space, or by a trip around the moon, or by a rocket to land on the moon, or by a rocket to go to the moon and back with a man? Is there any space program which will promise dramatic results in which we could win? And Lyndon Baines Johnson comes back with this, and I'll paraphrase. Basically what he's saying is, neither the Russians nor the U.S. can go to the moon and back. They kind of focus in on this moon idea. But LBJ says that with enough time and enough effort given, we could potentially go to the moon by 1956 or 1957. And with that, John F. Kennedy goes to joint meeting of Congress to ask for money so that we can go to the moon by the end of the decade. It's in this speech that he gives it. And I'll pull it back to the beginning here, so you kind of see how it opens and how he frames the space race. Why is it that we need to actually go to space?
If we are to win the battle that is now going on around the world between freedom and tyranny, the dramatic achievements in space which occurred in recent weeks should have made clear to us all, as did the Sputnik in 1957, the impact of this adventure on the minds of men everywhere who are attempting to make a determination of which road they should take. Since early in my term, our efforts in space have been under review. With the advice of the Vice President, who is Chairman of the National Space Council, we have examined where we are strong and where we are not, where we may succeed and where we may not. Now it is time to take longer strides, time for a great new American enterprise, time for this nation to take a clearly leading role in space achievement, which in many ways may hold the key to our future on Earth.
So you hear him talking about using space as a way to show superiority over the Russians. The idea that capitalism and the money and the technology that we can get advanced through our country and our democracy is better than that from the Soviets and from communism. And he makes mention of, for people who are watching, that they may choose the right path to follow, because they're worried about is that whole domino effect that they're kind of purporting, that we don't want communism to fall to these other smaller countries like Vietnam and Korea, and that the whole domino chipboard is going to fall with communism, and that they're going to eventually take over the world. And space is going to show how we can be superior to gain favor from those other countries. He does make mention later on in the speech, talking about communication satellites and weather observation satellites. It's kind of interesting to think that very early on in the space race, he and his technical advisors and scientists knew that these things would be important. These things are indispensable to our life today. The only thing maybe wouldn't have mentioned would be GPS satellites, and that was a little ways off. But communication satellites kind of fits in there. And weather, can you imagine not being able to see the hurricane that's coming off the coast and being able to give people advance warning of that? Incredible, incredible stuff. Later on, he does the famous line of, we request money for the following things: that we be able to send a man to the moon and bring him back safely to the earth by the end of the decade, before this decade is out. And that sets into the mindset of the people: man, moon, decade. We know mankind, we know ourselves, we can see the moon. It's not like Venus or Mars where they're just kind of points of light in the sky. You can really only see them with a telescope. The moon has its features, and we can see it well even with our own eyes at night. And the decade is a relatively short amount of time. It even would be beyond his term, although I'm sure he was hoping that he would get reelected and see this mission through by the end of his second term. That was one of the things that LBJ said, that it would be feasible to get done by the end of his second term. So now the technical part of how do you actually get to the moon? Well, you need a rocket, and the only rockets available at the time were missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles. And so NASA, their big job was to take the missile and certify it for human rating. And that was a little bit more of a task than you might think, because these things were blowing up quite a bit. They were kind of explodey and not very dependable, or as dependable as you need something to carry a person on at the time. And so that was a big challenge for them. Of course, the astronauts are watching these things blow up, but they are all test pilots at the time. They're not scientists, they are military test pilots, are all the astronauts. The first I forget how many astronauts there are. 7? I think 7 astronauts. The Mercury 7. Here is one of the Mercury 7. This is Alan Shepard, the first U.S. person into space. And then we've got a little bit more powerful rocket to actually take John Glenn into orbit, because the Redstone, the one on the left here, isn't powerful enough to take you into orbit, just enough to get into space and then back down. The forgotten middle child of the space race is, or the U.S. space program, is Project Gemini. where it's not yet Apollo, it's not moon missions yet. We're still in low Earth orbit, but it's a two-person craft, which is why they call it Gemini, because Gemini is that twin god, I believe. And they're doing all this stuff in low Earth orbit that they can practice to when they get to the moon. All this technical stuff like getting spacecraft to actually join together. So it's called docking and rendezvous. Figuring out different orbital mechanics, because it's kind of weird, counterintuitive. If you want to go faster and catch up with something, you actually have to slow down and drop into a lower orbit. If you try to speed up, fire your rocket so that you speed up to get closer to something, you're actually going to go up into a higher orbit, and that actually slows you down and pulls you further away. They had to learn all this stuff. Some of it they kind of knew by theory, but the astronauts need to learn it firsthand. A lot of interesting things going on. So this is one of the target vehicles that they had to try to dock with. Neil Armstrong had a scary thing happen with when they tried to dock with this. One of their thrusters got stuck on and started spinning them around, and they almost passed out. And they used up almost all their fuel just to correct the spin. They had to abort the mission and get back down to Earth as quick as possible. This is also when we do our first spacewalks, because of course when you walk on the moon, you have to walk in an EVA suit. It's fully pressurized, to make sure that the suit can keep you alive, can keep you at the right temperature, because in the sun you're at plus 200 some odd degrees Fahrenheit, and in the shade you're at minus 200 degrees Fahrenheit. So you got these huge temperature swings in space because you don't have the atmosphere to help mediate and absorb the heat of the sun. And you also have to be able to use your hands in space, in these pressurized gloves, so that can that actually work and can actually do work in science while you're in orbit and while you're on the moon. You may recognize this, you may not recognize this actually. This is the second person to ever walk on the moon. He was a Gemini astronaut before he was on Apollo 11. This is Buzz Aldrin, and he says this is the first space selfie ever taken. The Russians actually beat us to the space walking by, I think, again, just a couple days or a couple weeks. I forget who this is, apologies, but he almost dies because he can't get back into his spacecraft. It has an inflatable airlock, and he couldn't squeeze back through. They had to depressurize it a little bit, and finally he was able to get back in. The Russians are also actually the first to send a woman into space as well. The U.S. doesn't get around to that until the space shuttle era in the 80s with Sally Ride. So while the Mercury and Gemini programs are going on, they're figuring out what's going to be the best way to actually get to the moon. You have a couple different mission modes that you can use. One of them is called direct ascent, and it's the most straightforward. And it's one that you might think, like, why don't we just do that? Just take the whole rocket, stage it, and then land part of the rocket on the moon, and then take the whole rocket or part of the rocket and send that back to the Earth. It's the simplest, most effective perhaps, but the rocket that you need to do that is massive, or would have been massive. They never built it. They actually did design one. It's called Nova. If you ever look it up, the Nova rocket was a proposed rocket, bigger than the Saturn V, had 7 F1 engines on the first stage. It was just a beast, and NASA determined it would be too technical, too dangerous to try to make. Wernher von Braun really liked this idea, Earth orbit rendezvous. Let's make a space station in low Earth orbit and use that to refuel, to resupply. It would also keep him and his rocket engineers busy, because you would have to send up resupply missions, and that would keep him busy making and designing other rockets, and then send a spacecraft from that space station to the moon and back. Great idea. Wonderful architecture. Would last a lot longer. You could do a lot more with that. However, a little too many steps to get it done by the end of the decade. Remember, we've got that deadline set by JFK, and getting to this point now, he's been assassinated, and we really need to see this dream of our slain president through. And so the other one is a lunar orbit rendezvous, where you send 2 spacecraft up together, but only one of them goes and lands on the moon. And so to do that, they go through and make the Saturn V rocket, which is in and of itself just a marvel that they got this thing to work. They were having troubles with the first stage with these huge F1 engines. They were having combustion instability. It's still the biggest rocket to have ever flown at the recording of this video. SpaceX and other companies are designing and testing. SpaceX is testing bigger rockets that can take us back to the moon and Mars, but this one is still unmatched in its capability. You can kind of get a sense of that from Wernher von Braun here standing next to the huge F1 engines on the first stage. This is some mesmerizing footage of a launch. This is slow motion footage. This is an unmanned launch. So a lot of the slow motion footage that you see of the Saturn V launches is from this one test launch. I think it was like Apollo 5 or 6, one of the first all-up tests. All of these are engineering cameras. They really weren't made for cinematic viewing, but for engineers to see what's going on. So you see the engines are lighting up this huge plume of exhaust. This is all kerosene and liquid oxygen is the fuel, and what's great is in a couple seconds is going to get sucked back down underneath the rocket as the engines ramp up to full thrust. It creates low pressure down below the launch pad, so it sucks all that exhaust back down. And as you'll see in just a second, with that full thrust, the rocket starts to shake and vibrate. And you will see, starting to come down here, sheets of ice. And the sheets of ice are because the first stage and the second and third stage, the oxidizer is all liquid oxygen, which is rather cold stuff. It's like some -200 or 300 degrees Fahrenheit. There you start to see it starting to rain down. And it's especially coming down pretty hard from the first stage because they didn't put any insulation around the first stage, or very little insulation. So as soon as it starts shaking, or as soon as they start putting this oxidizer, this liquid oxygen in, it's the rocket would freeze you'd freeze your hand to it if you tried to touch it. Here you see the hold down clamp starting to release, and the whole mass of the rocket now is starting to lift off the pad, all because of the thrust of those 5 F1 engines. And the last thing that we're going to look for as this thing lifts off is the exhaust of the rocket. So you'll see kind of a blackish banded exhaust right coming out of the nozzle, and then you'll see that trailed by really bright exhaust. So this is actually a cooling technique. They pump cooler exhaust around the outside of the engine bell, and that actually cools the engine. If they didn't have that, the engine would be melted and burned. The exhaust, I don't know how hot it is, a couple thousand of degrees, and they need that cooler exhaust to actually keep it from destroying the engines. The main spacecraft that the astronauts inhabit on their way to the moon are the command and service module. This is really the only place that the astronauts can be. None of this is habitable. This is all oxygen tanks and life support systems. And of course, this can't land on the moon. You need the lunar excursion module to actually land on the moon. Only 2 astronauts go down in the L.E.M. To walk on the moon. You've got the command module pilot that stays back during that whole time. And for the L.E.M., only the top part actually gets back up to and docks with the command module. The Apollo program and the space race is a different story that we look at, is the story of technological advancements. It's just an incredible amount of things that they were able to do and invent and miniaturize to get all of this stuff to work. Namely, one of them is the Apollo guidance computer, which you're looking at here. And the code that they had to write for the Apollo guidance computer had to be all typed up at some point to be checked and to be entered into the computer, and this is all the code that went into the Apollo guidance computer. Something else to consider is you have to be able to communicate with the spacecraft at all times. And so if you only have a dish down in Houston, Texas, as soon as the spacecraft orbit takes it out of the line of sight of Houston, you can't talk to it anymore unless you have a deep space network radar dishes and radio dishes. And then they also retrofitted World War II Victory craft to house these communication devices as well, so they could communicate and get constant information and telemetry from the spacecraft at all times. There were, apart from Apollo 11, which landed on the moon on July of 1969, I think it was July of 1969, they had 6 other missions, and only 5 of them were successful. The unlucky Apollo 13 was one that was deemed a successful failure. They had an oxygen tank explode on their way to the moon, and it's one of my most favorite stories of the Apollo program, of getting them back home. So they don't get to land on the moon, but there's all this stuff that happens. There's CO2 that they can't get out of the atmosphere. There are batteries are exploding. They're going to run out of energy. They need to use the L.E.M as a lifeboat because all of its systems work. They have to do all these weird, funny course corrections, some of which is unguided, where they're just using the Earth as a guide to get them get them back on course, because there's things that are kind of moving them off course. With all that happened, it's amazing that they were able to survive and get back. This picture down here is an interesting one. In the picture is every person, alive or dead, except for command module pilot Michael Collins. And actually, as of the day of the recording, he actually just passed away. It makes this video somewhat timely, but it's an interesting thing to think about, that the person behind the camera, Michael Collins, is the only person not in that picture. Everyone else is alive in that picture, alive or dead, because of course you have the Earth there, and then you have Buzz and Neil coming back to join with the command module. Back on the Russian side of things, they did try to go to the moon. They made, actually, if they would have had more time and a little bit more money, they could have gotten this thing working. It's the N1 rocket. And this is a little animation of it, well, not animation, a little bit of a clip of it lifting off one of its test flights. And unfortunately, this is what happened with this and all the other test flights. It failed, and for this one in particular, it landed back on the pad, releasing all of its fuel in a rather big explosion. In fact, I was fact-checked with this. This is, I think, like the 7th or 8th largest non-nuclear accidental explosion in recorded history. So it's got like the energy of a small nuclear bomb unleashed onto the pad, which destroyed it, put them back a couple of years. They tried a couple other launches and couldn't get it working. So till this day, the United States is the only country to have landed people on the moon and brought them safely back. The space program is a program and a story of costs. It costs a lot of money to get to develop all the technology and to pay all the people and all the subcontractors and contractors to make all of those things custom and just for the space race. And it was at the peak 4.4% of the federal budget, which was billions upon hundreds of billions of dollars. I forget the exact amount, but it was an incredible amount of money. So much so. And this is maybe a little bit of nugget that you've never heard of before. John F. Kennedy, before he was assassinated, actually wanted to cancel the Apollo program. He saw that it was going to be too much. It was going to be too much money, too much of a risk. We'd be losing astronauts, risking astronauts' lives needlessly for this. His idea was let's join together with the Russians and land people on the moon as a joint mission. And that's what you see here in the quote. Work together as allies, forming this brotherhood, trying to work up, improve relations. Instead of competing, let's work together to send someone to the moon. And he was assassinated before he could see it through. And once he's assassinated, no one would have had the clout or the ability to cancel the moon program. it had the funding, it had the support, and now we had to see it through. We now have to see our slain presidents dream of men on the moon. That was the only way afterwards. It is a story of human cost as well, most notably from the U.S. side of things. We've got the Apollo 1 fire. To simplify things, our atmosphere, what we breathe in, is mostly nitrogen, and of course we need the oxygen. Our body needs the oxygen to survive and to carry out all the cellular respiration. The Apollo command module ran off of only oxygen, no nitrogen. And so they ran it 100% oxygen, just at a lower pressure, because otherwise there'd be way too much oxygen. Some body systems would start to burn out. 100% oxygen is very risky, especially with the command module. It was being rushed at the time. There were wiring flaws, and during a test, the astronauts here, Ed White, Roger Chaffee, and Gus Grissom, they were on the launch pad. They weren't going to launch that day, but they were testing out all the systems, running on internal power, and they flipped a switch, or a couple switches, and there was a short circuit. And with the 100% oxygen, there was a fire that caught and ran through the capsule very quickly. And the astronauts essentially burned alive from the on the inside. They couldn't get the hatch open quick enough. It would have been horrific. It was gruesome, and it was a major setback for the Apollo program. Many people thought that there's no way we can recover from this, to get this thing going, to get it people landed on the moon by the end of the decade, but they were able to pull it out. NASA conducted their own investigation. Was kind of a faux pas. Really, they should have had someone else come in, because it was them in charge. Like, they're investigating themselves, so they could make themselves come out as nice as they wanted to. But Congress they were kind of allowed to do that. There was loss of life on the Russian side as well. This was the remains of an astronaut and I apologize for the gruesomeness of it, but this is the remains of an astronaut for the first Soyuz mission, and the parachute just failed to deploy. And so he's just there. It came in way too fast, had really no hope of surviving that. There are only 3 people who have ever actually died in or in space. We've got the shuttle disasters, which we'll talk about in just a second, but these 3 cosmonauts really were the only 3 to die in space, because their capsule depressurized above 100 kilometers, which is kind of the international boundary between not space and space. The cost was so much, and with everything that was happening in the 60s, especially 1968. So the moon landing was 69. In 1968, it was a bad year in U.S. history. We've got Robert Kennedy being assassinated. That was John F. Kennedy's brother. We have Martin Luther King Jr. being assassinated. Vietnam, it's at its height of unpopularity and protests, and it's also kind of like the most amount of soldiers being killed overseas in Vietnam during this time. Race rioting and all this. It was a bad year, and people were protesting Apollo 11. They were saying, why are we sending so many people to the moon, or why are we sending people to the moon and spending so much money on the lunar program when we have so many problems back here on Earth? Here you see a poster about being able to feed the starving people back here on Earth because of the poverty rates. And someone from NASA actually came out and said, if we could push a button and allow all these problems to be solved, then we would do it. But it's just not that simple. You can't just throw money at problems and expect them to disappear. The problems of the social economic status of people during that time and today just can't be solved by things as simple as that. Now, after we get to the moon, then Congress is kind of like, well, we've gone to the moon. What else do we need to do? Or why do we need to keep funding it at that same level? So Congress really cuts Apollo's funding or NASA's funding afterwards. They do some interesting things like send up Skylab, and do some experiments in space and practice living in space for long term. They do this Soyuz Apollo mission where they join up with Russia, and it's kind of symbolic, kind of a political gesture, and it kind of works. We really actually start to work with Russia quite a bit in space and in science after, well, we kind of had scientists had always kind of worked with them, but we worked with them a little bit more in space after that point. We're not as seen as competitors, but more as kind of frenemies. Still not to getting together as long as maybe we would have hoped. And then we get the space shuttle going. Space shuttle is, for as amazing as it is, it's kind of a glorified pickup truck. It takes things to space. It can do some science in space, but then it comes back down. It just does all that in low Earth orbit. It doesn't go anywhere else other than that. And it's rather expensive. It was billed to Congress as a way to go to space and be cheap, you do it quickly, but shuttle really ends up costing a lot of money, and we couldn't get the same amount of missions as they were really hoping. The Russians actually try to copy our shuttle design. They call it the Braun, and actually it's a pretty cool rocket when you think about it. It's actually superior in some metrics and some numbers, but they only do it once. They only launch it once. It does it completely autonomously, so by computer and by pre-program, but then the Soviet Union falls and they have to scrap it. Kind of an unfortunate side story. This is where we get to some of the tragedies of the now the shuttle era. This is the Challenger crew, and most notably here is Christy McAuliffe. She's not an astronaut by trade or that's her main job. She's a teacher by her main job. And NASA did this thing where they wanted to send a teacher up into space. Originally it was going to be, they came up with a lot of ideas to try to build up publicity. This was all to try to gain the popularity that they had enjoyed during the Apollo era. We're sending men to the moon, this is exciting. And then with the shuttle, we're just going up into orbit and coming back. Not as exciting. But what if you send a teacher? So that was the idea. They actually at one point decided, why don't we send Big Bird from Sesame Street? That was on the short list of people to send. So we'll get to it here. The rocket exploded a little bit after after liftoff. What you'll see here is one of the white side boosters. Those are solid rocket boosters, and there was a leak in an O-ring, so the exhaust started to burn through, and it ignited the tank, that huge orange tank of liquid hydrogen and oxygen, and then explodes the whole stack, and we lose the whole crew. This is the first big loss of life during a mission for NASA that they have to contend with. We also have the crew of Columbia. This is in the early 2000s, I want to say 2004, 2005 perhaps, or maybe even earlier. They burn up on re-entry because of a phone strike that hits the leading edge of the wing. The orbiter has to come in, and when it comes in, re-enters through the Earth's atmosphere, coming back down to the land, the temperatures outside are really hot. You're compressing the air in front. It's coming in at 17,500 miles per hour. That's a lot of energy that gets built up. It creates a plasma, high energy, high temperature gas, and this foam strike blew a hole in the protective lining of that leading edge of the wing. So when they came in, the plasma went into the wing and started to break up the orbiter. So that's what you see up here. This is the debris of the orbiter. Total loss of life of the crew. The shuttle, for as troublesome as it was and as expensive, it was amazing for what they were able to accomplish. So you see here is the International Space Station, which is still one of the most complex construction projects ever undertaken by mankind to this date. It's been If you're watching this and you are under the age of 25, I believe, for your entire lifespan, we've never had the full population of Earth here on Earth's surface. We've always had someone up in the ISS that's been permanently manned for at least 25 years now. And amazing accomplishment. With the solar panels and everything, it's about the size of a football field. This is the Hubble Space Telescope, probably one of the most successful, amazing scientific instruments of the 20th century. And I'd rank it up there with, the Large Hadron Collider is going to be more the 21st century. But this thing's been able to allow us to see pictures of the deep universe and amazing, allowing us to see this grand view of God's creation unlike anything else. And the funny thing is, I say most successful. They send it up and they take these pictures, and all the pictures are blurry. They had ground the mirror to the wrong precision, to the wrong measurement. Actually, they made it really precise, but they ground it wrong. the readings that they were getting from the measurement tool, they were slightly off calibrated. So they had to send other shuttle missions to recalibrate it, and that's how they got it to function. So is space exploration worth it? I submit here a list of things from a Wikipedia page called NASA Spinoff Technology. And you can see everything that we've gained by space exploration and the technology that was developed for space exploration. All these things had a root in NASA technology that they used to send people into space, into the moon, and to work in low Earth orbit. Things like Tempur-Pedic foam, food safety, gold plating, 3D food printing, cochlear implant, allowing people to hear even if they're partially deaf. All of that has come about from NASA technology, so we've definitely reaped the benefit of that. So you saw from the title of this video and the thumbnail that I'm proposing that the Apollo program and some of the space race is kind of a modern day Tower of Babel. And here's the reason why. If you watch a documentary on the Apollo program, or if you hear a historian talk about it or read a book, you may hear or see a phrase like this: the Apollo program is evidence that if we put our mind to it, there's nothing that we can't accomplish as a human race. And by itself, accomplishments, doing amazing feats of technology and doing things like going to the moon, I don't think is inherently sinful. However, what we run into is what the people of the Tower of Babel ran into. They made that tower to glorify themselves. And if we see our own glory alone in the accomplishments of things like the space race, then we fall into the same trap. If you look ahead to the future, where people like Elon Musk want us to be in the future, going to the moon and colonizing Mars, by itself, if you go to the moon or go to Mars, is that in and of itself a temptation? No. That might excite you, that might give you something to live for, might interest you quite a bit. I know it interests me, the idea of going to the moon and back to Mars. The thing is, though, a lot of people are doing that just because they are afraid and they do not trust God's plan for the future. They are thinking that we need to ensure the salvation of humanity by ourselves. And that is where you run into the temptation of where your trust is at. Is your trust in yourselves, in our own technological accomplishments, or is your trust in the Lord? You do have to ask yourself that with things. And that's why I think a lot of people, when they look at the Apollo program, kind of fall into that temptation, the same mindset as the people did in the Tower of Babel. So anyway, thank you for checking this video out. Probably the next video will hopefully be a live stream, and so I'll be posting when that's going to be. And I'd love for you to tune in on YouTube and send in your questions. I think it'd be great to make this a conversation over the summer as I bring in different people so we can talk about these different subjects and make this a summer of learning and enrichment and growing in faith with what we've learned from one another. So thanks again for tuning in, and I hope to see you again soon. Bye.